Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that very nice introduction, and congratulations on the wonderful news of the 7 grandchildren. Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dul Kifli Abdul bin Razak has been an extraordinary influence on my own life. We met about 12, 13 years ago, and his visionary work in the field of higher education, has extended, all over the world. And so he has many people like myself in virtually every continent who have been supported by his own vision and have felt, a closeness to his remarkable passion for linking learning with the achievement of a better life. So I'm delighted that he has been honored with the position of the rector of this university. It's from what we can see, a beautiful university and a very important university at this time in history. And I have no doubt that, as with the work that he's done in other universities and as former president of the International Association of Universities, this university, all of you will be finding more visibility for your work, and you will be supported in your own visionary work, and that this university will soon be known even more as a place where learning, justice, and sustainability are all combined, in one vision. Let's see if this works. This one. I have a friend. Whoops, this is not the start. No, it's, how can I get it to the beginning? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Let me just practice this. Yes, now it's working. Thank you very much. I have a friend, some of you know, a fellow called Dr. Rajesh Tandon from India, and he says about PowerPoints, he says, PowerPoints have no power and have no point. But anyway, I'm here with I hope there will at least be communication. If no power and no point, I hope at least there will be communication. I come from the coast and Strait Salish, the traditional territory of the indigenous people of the First Nations people of this island that we call Vancouver Island. That's its colonial name. And you can see in the small map, you can see where it's located. Canada, of course, is on top of the US, and our island is on the far west coast. We are a Pacific coast island. And this is the land that I come from. I have been a guest on that territory for about 18 years now. And whenever I speak, I always make a point of acknowledging the indigenous, the original peoples on whoever territory we are on here. So I am in spirit acknowledging the ancestors and the original peoples who would have been here, long before this building was built, long before the big city of Kuala Lumpur. There were people here for tens of thousands of years, and it's important that we recognize that and that we honor that as well. My talk is actually called Decolonization of Higher Education, Knowledge, Democracy, and Values. And I wanted to say something about when we talk about decolonization, where do we begin? We don't begin by jumping right into how to reorganize the curriculum of a university. on questions of decolonization, we have to begin, I have to begin at least with myself. And you can see that picture. That's a picture of a family in about 1871. Obviously, it's an English farm family who have just been able to get a hold of 200 acres of very good land, farming land, that was stolen from the indigenous people of that island. And those people are my great-grandparents and their family. So my great-grandparents were poor people, had no land. They came from England. They settled. I am a descendant of I am a colonial settler. And I have benefited because those people that you see in that picture were transformed from being absolutely penniless people to being middle-class people by obtaining 200 acres of wonderful land, but taking it from the indigenous people. The indigenous families of my age and younger have experienced a life of poverty. Directly from the taking of that land, which was once their, the place where they found medicines, where they did hunting, and where they made their lives. So when we're talking about decolonization, I think it's important to think about that. I also want to acknowledge and to share with you the Canadian history of cultural genocide. We have the colonial project in Canada was a very vicious one, and to some degree it remains so vis-a-vis indigenous peoples. And the idea of the white colonial people who settled in Canada was that somehow these indigenous people were kind of second class, not even quite sure if they're full people, and the only way to help them was to assimilate them into becoming, more like the white European settlers. And so they created a series of residential schools, and they pulled children out of their families. They sent them away to schools. They cut their hair. They put them in uniforms. They forbid them to speak their language, and they basically broke the cultural link for some 70, 80 years between young people and their parents, so that now you have most of the indigenous people in Canada today are still living through the trauma of that cultural genocide. To give you an idea of the way that white colonial people in Canada were thinking at the time. This is our first prime minister. He's a fellow from Scotland. And he said that when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He forgets that half of them were women, is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thoughts are Indian. He is simply a savage who cannot read and write. We have, in 2015, we released in Canada an extraordinary report. And if you're interested in issues about identity, oppression, reconciliation, and so forth, I commend this to you. It's all available online. It's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Report. And in it, this has been disseminated widely. It's supported by all institutions, universities, law courts, all aspects of public life have been affected by the recommendations from this from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it begins with the recognition for the first time of the atrocities that have happened through what we call the residential school period and another period called the 60s scoop. You'll start to see in a university like my own, which is the University of Victoria. The name Victoria, by the way, it can't get much more colonial than that. There are Victorias and all over the world. I know of at least 2 or 3 other universities. So we have, and the newspaper in my town, you will laugh at this, the newspaper in my town is still, this is 2018, is still called the Times Colonist. The Times Colonist. My wife calls it the Times Communist, but it's not. You'll find universities across Canada are very sincerely, moving towards responding to the challenge of becoming more inclusive, of indigenizing, of decolonizing. And what you see here is a picture of the first People's House. It's right in the center of the campus. It's a ceremonial hall. It's a space for First Nations students to learn. It's a space for dialogue and discussion between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And you'll find, if you look at the website of the University of Victoria, you will find that we have an Indigenous strategic plan, an Indigenous academic plan for the university, and it begins with these words: it's important to begin with an acknowledgement of the role that educational institutions, including post-secondary institutions, have played in the perpetuation of colonial systems, both historically and in contemporary times. So I want to talk a little bit about knowledge and dispossession. The geographer David Harvey has elaborated the concept of accumulation through dispossession to explain how capital, the basis of our dominant economic system, began to be accumulated. Dispossessing people of access to their land, he suggests, lies at the heart of early capital accumulation. He tells us of wealthy landowners who used force and even arms to transform the traditional open fields and communal pastures of England into private property for their own profit. Each of these acts of dispossession left the majority of people without access to land and allowed for wealth to accumulate to those who were now known as private landowners. New categories of people were defined: the landed gentry and the workers on the estate and the landless. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to spend a few days in one of the Oxford colleges. That's that picture there. A college that was created at the same time as the enclosures in the Middle Ages, in the 1600s. I entered the college through a low doorway, only accessible to students and fellows and their guests. The college was walled in and only accessible through 1 or 2 guarded entryways. While staying in the college, the linkage between the enclosing of previously common land for private purposes and the creation of walled spaces for learning became disturbingly apparent. The act of creating Oxford and the other medieval universities was an act of enclosing knowledge, limiting access to knowledge, exerting a form of control over knowledge, and providing a means for a small elite to acquire this knowledge for purposes of leadership of a spiritual nature, or a governance nature, or a cultural nature. Those within the walls became known as knowers, people who knew. Those outside of the walls became non-knowers. Knowledge was removed from the land, from the relationships of those sharing the land. The enclosing the academy dispossessed the large majority of knowledge keepers, forever relegating their knowledge to witchcraft, tradition, superstition, folkways, or at best, some form of common sense. Whoops, wrong one. Wrong one. Oh dear. I got to go back to. Okay, no. Okay. I want to now share some stories, some knowledge stories. These are stories, if you think of stories having a character, the lead role in these stories is knowledge. And I want to start with the Mpambo African multiversity. You see the picture here. In the late 1990s, a Ugandan intellectual and civil society activist Ndaula Wangula returned home to his kingdom of Busoga in eastern Uganda after 25 years in various parts of Africa and abroad, he came to report to his elders on what he had learned from his work outside of the country. The message to his elders was this: "You sent me out, one of the lesser young people of my generation, to gain Western knowledge and to work in the structures and organizations of the Western world. I have been to their universities, I have worked with their governments, I have created Western-style organizations here in Africa, and now I have come home to share what I have learned. I have come to tell you that we, the children of the Busoga Kingdom, the children of Africa, will never fully realize our full potential as people in our communities and as contributors to the global treasury of knowledge if we continue to depend wholly on the content and ways of knowledge of the European peoples. Our way forward must be linked to the recovery, replenishment, revitalization of our thousands of years old indigenous knowledge." The University of Abalale Basim Jondolo, South Africa. In 2005, in Durban, South Africa, some of the inhabitants of the tin-roofed shacks of the city created a blockade on Kennedy Road to protest the sale of land originally promised to the poor for house building. They gave it instead to an industrialist to build a shopping mall. The movement of those living in these shacks has grown into what's called Abalale Basim Jondolo. Jondolo is the name in Zulu for a tin shack, the shack dwellers movement. But what is interesting and unique to this social movement is that they have created their own University of Abalale Basim Jondolo, a space for the creation of knowledge about survival, hope, and transformation, where the shack dwellers themselves are the scholars, the professors, and the teachers. They create and they share knowledge through song, through live action debates and discussions, and document the knowledge in a web-based archive. My final story begins with a young indigenous woman from the Lillooet First Nations in British Columbia. In the 1960s, she was chosen by her community to work as a research guide for a non-indigenous linguist who had expressed an interest in working on the development of an alphabet for the Stadtlerniks language. She was successful in this challenge, and her people have made use of this alphabet since that time. By now, by 2018, this woman has become a leading authority on indigenous languages in Canada. Her name is Wanatsa in her own language, or Dr. Lorna Williams. She has become the leading scholar of indigenous language revitalization. But the fate of the languages in her community and the fate of most of the indigenous languages of Canada have not fared so well. The impact of colonial domination of Western language traditions has resulted in linguicide, or the death or near death of those carriers of our global cultural heritage. In each of these stories that I've shared with you, knowledge is central. Knowledge is the star of each drama. Knowledge is dynamic, active, engaged, and linked to social, political, cultural, or sustainable changes. Priya's co-construction of knowledge is linked to a variety of social movements. Mpambo's mother tongue scholars are stimulating an unprecedented reawakening of African spiritual knowledge. The shack dwellers of Durban have taken the word university as their own and turned knowledge hierarchies upside down in the service of the poor. I just wanted to show you this image. I'm wondering, you can see it's a map of some kind, but perhaps you wouldn't know what the scale, how they have scaled that map. You can see across the title is the Global Production of Knowledge. This map uses as its scale the production of academic knowledge in the world. So you can see starting on the left, let's see, yes. Is there a pointer? Oh, it doesn't matter. On the left, that big blue, huge blue ball, that's the United States. Below the United States, you see that small green thing down there? That's Latin America. And it's bigger, geographically bigger than North America. But production of knowledge compared to that is very small. The sort of purple, violet in the middle, that's Europe. That's Europe. And you can see that little, small, tiny little kind of string dangling down off of Europe, that's the continent of Africa, where all life began. And look at where it's the knowledge, the production of knowledge, in the kind of the formal academic production of knowledge. Look at how small it is. So I share this with you because it's important to this is actually the world. This is the world that we live in. Rajesh Tandon and myself and others have been working along this concept of knowledge democracy. And it really is the message that I want to leave with you. There are basically 7 principles that we've developed and that we feel are important to keep in mind. If we take the idea of values, which is the theme of this conference, seriously, if we keep in mind, the colonial patterns of knowledge production and distribution, which still exist in this world, and if we want to work in a way to use knowledge, as those small examples, to use knowledge in a really transformative way, to make our families, our communities, our lives better, then we think that moving more towards away from knowledge economy towards knowledge democracy is a way to go. So the principles are as you see. I've written a paper, a longer paper, so a lot of what I'm saying today will be available to you afterwards. You'll have the full text, afterwards. But just to go over some. So the first principle is that, and it's around decolonization. Decolonization of knowledge means that we have to recognize multiple ways of knowing. And just as we know that the world is healthier, when we know that there is more biodiversity, so we need to remember that the world is healthier when we think of a diversity of knowledge systems, an ecology of knowledges, rather than a monocultural, knowledge system. We also need to think about, we need to be able to use multiple social and even aesthetic, arts-based research. If we think about research, we simply must get away from the idea that the peer-reviewed journal and the published books that nobody can afford to buy are the only way to share knowledge. That's I think probably one of the main characteristics of political economy of knowledge production, which is holding universities back from making the contribution that they are so well positioned to make. And it's the very narrow idea of how we do research and how we share research findings. We need to be able to go beyond, the sort of the academic means of reproduction of knowledge, sharing knowledge, to plays, to songs, to drums, to ceremonies, all kinds of other ways to share research. Ordinary, life isn't, life isn't changed, by reading a peer-reviewed academic journal. In fact, studies show that 70% of the articles written in peer-reviewed journals are read by nobody. Nobody. And even those of us who get a few reads, the average is about 2 or 3, and that's not including, or that is including your own mother. So, we need to. We also, or Father, we need also, but we're not displacing the idea of the centrality or the importance of knowledge. In fact, we're reinforcing the idea that knowledge lies at the heart of social, ecological, cultural transformation. Knowledge is key. We're not talking about just activism or just movements of various kinds. We're talking about knowledge, but knowledge which is co-constructed with community, co-constructed with the social movements, co-constructed, with the ancient knowledge, the keepers of ancient knowledge systems. And we also need to, then the question of, there's two points around sharing of knowledge that are really critical. One of them is, I've highlighted it, it's probably because this is a topic of special interest to us in Canada these days, is there's a concept when working with Indigenous communities. The tradition has been for researchers to go into Indigenous communities, basically ask a bunch of questions, come out, write a report. The information never goes back to the community, and one never really knows what the purpose was, and research has actually been one of the tools for domination and dispossession with Indigenous communities. So a number of principles have emerged from our work in Canada, coming from our Indigenous scholars, and they're very worth noting. It's called OCAP. That means ownership, control, access, and possession. So when you're working with an Indigenous community or you're working with other marginalized communities, one needs to be totally respectful. That knowledge belongs to those communities. They have the right to determine what happens to the knowledge which is generated. They have the right to control the distribution of that knowledge. If they want to share it, that's fine. If they don't want to share it, that is also their right. So if you are working in communities that are marginalized or or Indigenous or other qualities, keep these principles in mind. But, and it's not a contradiction, but for most of us doing research, most of us working, we are very comfortable publishing those of us who, like myself in a university, publishing in a journal that somebody has to buy, or publishing in a book that somebody has to buy, and perhaps the market, we have to move. We are moving now. There's a movement called open access. Open access. Myself and my colleague Rajesh, we have agreed that we will never publish a single article, a single book, nothing unless it's open access. Research, there's a universal right to be able to see free of cost. You can imagine if a book costs, these days books are terribly expensive in Canada, $100, $150. You can imagine, translate that into your own currency. Who's going to buy that? What's the point? What's the point of doing all that work? And the journal business, the market-driven journal business is really is a racket. Academics work for free. We give them our knowledge products. They sell those knowledge products to libraries and to other people. And there are more and more journals that are coming out that are open access, and more publishers. So I would really encourage you strongly to, next time I know from yesterday's ceremony, you're a very active and productive academic community, and you have publishing a lot of books. So thinking about, open access is important. So let me just close with the following. Decolonization, knowledge democracy, and value-based research are all concepts which are emerging as the chorus. The multitudes of ordinary persons in the world are in revolt against the gods of academia. Students demonstrate in South Africa for a break from the apartheid of white knowledge that has persisted even though the politics of apartheid were broken many years ago. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls upon all universities in Canada to decolonize their curriculum, to include the stories of colonial cultural genocide perpetrated on the Indigenous peoples of Canada in the teachings so that all students can finally begin to hear the truth. Knowledge movements of women who say no to continued sexual exploitation, urban poor who create tent cities in the midst of wealth to draw attention to housing affordability, and environmental and Indigenous activists all over the world who say no to fossil fuel extraction, all understand the transformative power of knowledge to the success of their movements. The idea of knowledge, whose knowledge counts, how grassroots knowledge is gathered may be a compelling topic in a seminar in this university, but the creation of knowledge and the naming of the world is more importantly part of a great turning that we are all living through. Thank you very much for your attention.